Nintendo is ramping up to have a pretty heavy 2021. We're expecting to have Pokemon's 25th anniversary with all but confirmed Pokemon Diamond and Pearl remakes, Mario after its 35th anniversary with Super Mario 3D World plus Bowser's Fury, and possibly more. And of course, we can't forget Animal Crossing after a record year becoming the second best-selling Switch game in only 9 months' time. We are all anticipating and waiting for one of the biggest announcements from Nintendo since the drop of the Nintendo Switch itself, the Nintendo Switch Pro. Now, with the Nintendo Switch approaching its 4th year in production, rumors have been speculated and leaked since 2019 on an upgraded version of the Nintendo Switch outside of the base unit and the Nintendo Switch Lite. The Wall Street Journal reported in 2019 that Nintendo is to launch 2 new Switch models and that new gaming consoles will be released as early as this summer. The article regarding this was posted on March 25th, 2019. Now, the article states Nintendo company plans to launch 2 new versions of its Switch gaming console as early as this summer. People familiar with the matter said Nintendo seeks to sustain sales momentum for the product going into the crucial 3rd year. When analysts speculate on what features the Switch Pro will have or should include, it is normally centered around the processing power in high resolution or even as of late 4K games. While lots of Nintendo fans love their first-party games, Nintendo has seemingly been trying to break into the third-party market as well. With the PlayStation 5 and Series X being released in late 2020, Nintendo has to do something about upgrading their system in order to complement many of these third-party games such as Overwatch, Fortnite, and Diablo. Now, while these games work seamlessly on the Nintendo Switch base unit, new release games coming out over the next few years are only going to become more powerful and require more processing power to run. Now, after 2020 ended, there were a lot of questions for Nintendo regarding their consoles at hand. At the beginning of the global situation and lockdown, Nintendo was scrambling to come up with production solutions with the extremely high demand while everyone was stuck at home. Now that Nintendo has seemingly caught up with this issue, it poses the question, when will the Nintendo Switch Pro release? At the beginning of 2020, the Nintendo president Shuntaro Furukawa himself shot down the possibility of a Pro launch that year. That was in January, so the global situation didn't have any current influence yet. But at the start of 2020, Nintendo didn't really need to announce a new system. They were rolling on all sorts of momentum with the wild success of the Nintendo Switch Lite release in September of 2019, then Pokemon Sword and Shield release after that, which quickly became successful and eventually shot up to the 3rd best-selling Pokemon series behind Red and Blue and Gold and Silver. Months later, in March of 2020, as soon as the global crisis hit, Animal Crossing, which Nintendo already knew was going to be a huge success, shattered many expectations. Nintendo wanted to ride that momentum as much as possible. Other than Animal Crossing, Nintendo had a pretty decent year with releases like Xenoblade Chronicles and Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity. 2020 will be looking to be a huge year riding on new game announcements such as The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild 2, Metroid Prime 4, Bayonetta 3, and the upcoming Pokemon Diamond and Pearl remakes. It also might be worth noting that when both Nintendo Switch consoles were released, they were released alongside a Legend of Zelda game, with the first being Breath of the Wild and Link's Awakening. Now, last year, a leaker named Sabi suggested that Breath of the Wild 2 was due for a 2020 release, but warned that normally Zelda releases are delayed and expected that to happen with the Breath of the Wild 2 release. Now, fast forward to 2021 and still no news on the release, so it seems like they were correct on that leak, as the leaker has since claimed that Breath of the Wild 2 has been delayed, likely into 2021. Now, as mentioned before, The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild released alongside the base unit of the Nintendo Switch in March of 2017. It sold 21 million copies and became the best-selling game of the series. Would Nintendo be foolish to not release its Pro console alongside a game that's being highly anticipated by millions of consumers? I think it's pretty obvious that we know that answer. Now, one thing that will truly factor in all of these questions will certainly be if Nintendo is able to get the manufacturing done. 2020 was a year that certainly pushed the livelihood of all developers as well as manufacturers, but luckily many of them have seemingly been able to adapt to the current infrastructure and reach expectations. With lots of big releases on the rise and Nintendo's absolute need for bigger and better third-party games, expect Nintendo to announce the Pro sooner rather than later. It would only benefit them and allow for developers to align themselves with the new releases, and it would also provide a perfect opportunity for Nintendo to enhance the previous games to make them run even better and preferably at 4K. Now, as for a concrete release date, it is really hard to say. One thing that I've mentioned in the past is that the perfect time for them to announce the Switch Pro is in the first half of this year, year, preferably before the end of their fiscal year, with hopefully an insane general direct that happens for Zelda 35th that announces both the Nintendo Switch Pro, Breath of the Wild 2 release date, and more. Now, before we end things, I wanted to go over what current industry insiders and analysts have to say about the Switch Pro's release. According to Sirkin Toto from Canton Games, he says that I think the Switch Pro will come in the second half of 2021, and just like the Lite was launched with a new Zelda, the Pro is likely to debut together with a blockbuster title, which is insinuating Breath of the Wild 2. Now, as for Michael Proctor, he said that I would err on the side of a no for this year, mostly because they were out of stock of the Switch for so long and chose to ramp up production. However, I expect that we'll get a new one next year. And last but not least, we have David Cole of DFS Intelligence, and he says, normally we don't like to speculate on unannounced projects like the Switch Pro, but in this case, I am willing to go on record saying I think it's unlikely there will be a new major console from Nintendo in 2021. However, there may be some tweaks to the existing Switch. Whether that is enough to call it a new system or even a Switch Pro, I think is unlikely. So there you have it. I personally agree with what David has to say. I don't think this next Nintendo Switch Pro is going to be super insane. I've always said that I think this is going to be a mid-gen refresh, but it'll feature a 4K dock with the 4K UHD SoC. But I guess we're going to have to wait and find out. I think that we're going to get a Switch Pro. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when, as I've said in the past. So are we going to get a Nintendo Switch Pro mid-generation refresh? Let me know what your take is in the comments. This has been Wes, and I will see you on the next video.